Thank you all for being here. I really appreciate it. But I just want to preface this lecture by saying that I won't really be talking about the specific history of Charlie so much, or the people in the photographs. So if you find that you really love the photographs that you're seeing, I encourage you all to check out this book that Larry Len Peterson, another Russell scholar, wrote, and it has tons of images of Russell, not only in Bullhead Lodge and Glacier National Park, but throughout his life, and a great history and biography and narrative about his stories. So in developing the current exhibition, Going to the Sun, Artists in Glacier National Park, I became interested in dozens of photographs in the museum's collection that featured the artist Charles Russell, his wife Nancy, and their various friends at Russell's summer cabin on Lake McDonald. In this black and white parade of familiar landscape and noteworthy faces, I marveled at the cozy woodland retreat that the Russells built for themselves within the wilds of Montana, surrounded by friends and nurtured by creativity. Like watching a silent movie through a series of film stills, I flipped through files of photographs and digital images, many of which were copies of one another, reproduced by their various owners, family, friends, acquaintances, and strangers, who gifted these images to our museum and other institutions for safekeeping and for the benefit of our collective memory. And in looking, I asked myself, what can we learn from these photographs? As a museum, we are tasked with not only maintaining and caring for our collections for the good of the public, but also with providing interpretations of them, and in doing so, fostering critical inquiry and promoting educational experiences through their close study. Family albums, personal photographs, and scrapbooks are interesting works of history and art in that they have lived a previous life more intimate and storied than most other forms. Woven into family lore, friendships, and celebrity awe, photographs carry with them flexible narratives written by memory and experience, longing and fascination for the people and the past and the permanence of place. More often than not, once gifted to an institution, many of these stories become lost. The invisible film of orality and memory that once coated the surface of the image is scrubbed away in the precarious transfer of ownership from person to institution. Because of this inevitable loss, we must build new knowledge of these objects, tracing the breadcrumbs of history in our pockets of insight toward their logical, or at least interesting, conclusions. And so it is with a critical spirit, incomplete knowledge, and wild imagination that we can begin to look at Charlie Russell through the lenses of his contemporaries gathered at Bullhead Lodge. The beauty of photography is that it can tell a story using the poetics of the visual. Much like a novel, the photograph creates a lasting record of what once was only a fleeting sensory experience. And yet it, like the novel, still depends on the echo of the spoken word in our head to bring it to life. The strength and reach of photography and the oral narrative are predicated upon the ability of each medium to reproduce itself through repetition in pattern, replication of form, and recitation from memory. Critic and art historian Martha Langford has written at length on the parallel structures of the oral narrative and the photographic image. Langford writes, "Sound, like the photographic moment, is fugitive. Its utterance coincides with its disappearance. Recitation revives the original utterance, bringing it into a continuous present, just as the making and viewing of a photograph creates a continuum with the past." This coupling between the oral and the visual, the past and the present, finds its apotheosis in the artist and in Charles Russell. Often when we look at Charlie, we see him through the visual, in photographs and in his paintings and sculptures, all of which have lasted beyond the physical presence of the man himself. In losing Charlie, we have also lost what is perhaps his most accomplished art form, his storytelling, as it unfolds through the fleeting sensory experience of the oral and the aural. A natural storyteller, Russell is said to have been in the company of peers with Will Rogers and Irvin Cobb, who were two of the most celebrated storytellers and humorists of the early 20th century. Rogers wrote of him that, quote, "If he had devoted the same time to writing that he had to his brush, he would have left a tremendous impression in that line. He was a great storyteller. Any of our old traditions couldn't paint a word picture with the originality that Charlie could. What a public entertainer he would have made," unquote. Russell's voice, body language, sense of timing, and ability to read an audience brought to life and laughter many of the range tales, colorful characters, and satires of modern life that he collected over the years. A man steeped in the oral tradition of the open range, Russell excelled as a performer, such that, quote, "when another person repeated a Russell story, the impact was never as good as the original," unquote. More often than not, the Russell we see is the one placed uncomfortably on display, stiff and posed. But when Russell is at ease, he comes alive, and he was most at ease at Bullhead Lodge. Here, in an environment that he had once described as, quote, "about as wild a place as you can find these days," unquote, Russell and his guests were apt to display the more playful and carefree sides to their personalities. And although we only get a few photographic glimpses of this break-informal character from Russell, we can see the full expression of his spirit within the works of art that he created in Glacier Park. The whimsical figures of the gnomes fashioned from the park's landscape, the birch bark greeting cards and poems, and the humorous illustrated letters and drawings of the park, incidents, tourists, and encounters with wildlife provide us with a portrait of Russell that more closely approximates his humor and character in the flesh. In this talk, I will attempt to paint a more intimate portrait of a place by linking the photographs of an artist and the art he produced at Bullhead Lodge. So the environs of the park acted as a catalyst for Russell and other artists to indulge in their sensory perceptions. Such immersion and meditative awareness stimulated the creation of art that valued immediacy, singularity, and natural form, values that are present in both the sketch and in photography. As Galassi notes, quote, "landscape sketches presented a new and fundamentally modern pictorial syntax of immediate synaptic perceptions and discontinuous unexpected forms. It is the syntax of an art devoted to the singular and contingent rather than the universal and stable. It is also the syntax of photography," unquote. Seen here are a few of the oil and watercolor studies that illustrate the distinction between the etude and the ébauche in Russell's own work. Etudes can be either fragmentary representations, as in the rock and tree study, which shows the face of the rocky outcropping, or broader studies of the terrain and the effects of light, as seen in Reynolds Mountain and Mount Jackson, which shows a sweeping view of the rocky beach, Lake McDonald, and the distant vista of mountains in the background. Both types are considered direct observations of nature, imperfect realities, and records of Russell's plein air work that capture a specific moment in time. In the execution of these etudes, Russell develops both a deeper understanding of one aspect of our particular piece of the landscape, as well as the principal tones of the sky, earth, and water as seen through the lighting of the landscape at a particular time of day. While in Russell's ébauche paintings, like Elk Study and White-tailed Deer and Forest Setting, the artist creates lively and loose compositional studies that set down color notes and positions of figures in what will ultimately become an idealized landscape within a larger finished painting. These oil studies show up in Russell's work around 1910 and predominantly feature the landscape of Glacier Park. Their appearance can likely be traced to the influence and artistic practices of Russell's New York artist friends, illustrators and painters like Philip Goodwin. Naturally, Russell's summer guests were exposed to a variety of cultural influences throughout their lives that shaped them in various ways. I propose that one of the ways in which experience shaped those who stayed at Bullhead Lodge was in the molding of aesthetic tastes, principally through the union of art and nature. The conceptual marriage of art and nature is a product of the Victorian era and the American concept of manifest destiny, both of which celebrated romanticism and the intrinsic spiritual link between art and the natural world. These broad cultural undertones, linking the realms of art and nature, help to underpin and reinforce the aesthetic experience and cultural sentiments that were introduced to visitors at Bullhead Lodge. Environments like Bullhead Lodge, cultivated by Russell, and Glacier National Park, whose development was accelerated by efforts of men like Louis Hill of the Great Northern Railway and hotel proprietors like John Lewis, stressed the pairing of art and nature. Thus, repeated exposure to these places strengthened and encouraged the growth of artistic tastes in both artists and visitors, and as such, molded each person's habitus to reflect their lived experience. Here, within the bounds of the cabin and adjacent park, and captured in the photograph's reflection, we can see the manifestation of habitus that links art and nature as it is lived and performed by the residents and photographers of Bullhead Lodge. In these photographs, we encounter images that reflect the staged, the intimate, the grand, and the dramatic from the cameras of amateurs and professionals alike. These categories are helpful in understanding the maneuvering between photographer and the subject, as well as the outcome realized, whether or not desired, by the photographer. In many cases, the artistic impulse that emerges from the creation of these photographs is achieved through the manipulation of formal elements, composition, subject, light, etc., or by capturing dramatic action. Both in Bullhead Lodge and nearby, we see how place evokes the creation of visual art, painterly, sculptural, and the photographic, as well as performance art as seen in the physical bearing and role-playing activities of its visitors. Of particular interest and note are these two photographs of visitors at Bullhead Lodge engaged in play acting. These images, with their accompanying handwritten captions on scraps of paper, are taken from an album in the Britzman collection that was once a part of Nancy Russell's estate, now owned by the Gilcrease Museum. The text near the first image reads, quote, "The cave man and woman," unquote, which seems to be maybe Isabel Russell or an unidentified woman, and perhaps Austin Russell. And then the other reads, quote, "Gay 90s Martha and Banty," unquote, which is perhaps Martha Gabelson, who was Russell's housekeeper, and Mary DeYoung, Joe's mother, whose nickname was Banty. So these photographs reveal a side of revelry and role-playing that was a key form of leisure, social bonding, and an outlet for the imagination that was indulged in by Russell's visitors and actively documented. This practice of trying on new identities carves out a temporary space of belonging and being as other. Within these new identities, one can challenge normal social dynamics and push against the boundaries of prescribed roles. The act of becoming is an act of experimentation, and experimentation was ripe in a place like Bullhead Lodge. The physicality of the body, especially when engaged in deliberate posing and performance, makes itself abruptly aware to us in the photographs taken at Bullhead Lodge. We are reminded that photography itself is an inherently physical medium at both ends of the camera. The photographer must actively position him or herself, physically take the photograph, and in some cases develop in the studio, while at the other end, the subjects themselves are often acutely aware of and participant in the experience of being photographed as they engage the camera through both pose and expression. Ethnographic filmmaker David McDougall's idea of the corporeal image provides a lens through which to examine how bodies and people present themselves in space. For McDougall, the corporeal image is the physicality of a person's experiences, as lived, as recalled, and as secondhand, seen through media like film and photography. In this last aspect, the physicality of the medium itself becomes the primary means of engagement. It becomes a vehicle through which phantom bodies, transcribed onto photographs, can contribute to our own knowledge of sense, experience, memory, and socio-environmental awareness. Through their bodies, we can discover our own. How this transfer of knowledge is interpreted and how meaning is created can be either a process of discovery for ourselves or a conditioned expectation. The photographs of Russell and others in active pose or role-playing in Indian attire elicit sensations of materiality and the physical. The drape of garments, crunch of undergrowth, and weight of the metal firearm, pipe, packs, and lithe cigarette all act as anchoring impressions. These tactile images make the viewer aware of his or her own body and what it means to be connected to and to know something through touch. These sensations ground us within the photograph and its surrounding backdrop, which appears frequently in duplicate. The forest surrounding Bullhead Lodge becomes, for the viewer, a familiar stage with multiple recurring actors. These photographs also tend toward the theatrical. Taken by both Nancy Russell and Philip Goodwin, these images were developed and traded between the two artists. More likely than not, These particular shots were used as pictorial aide-memoirs, which were referred to in creating compositions for paintings. For instance, Goodwin painted several compositions of outdoorsmen using trump lines as a method of carrying their packs, a subject matter which may have been aided by the Bullhead Lodge photographs. But looking beyond this purely practical motive, we may also understand these photographs as records of masculine performance. In name, outward appearance, and atmosphere, Bullhead Lodge is a site of masculine activity. Its very location encourages outdoor pursuits and the proclivities of men in hunting, fishing, hiking, and going on excursions into the wild. The male persona as a woodsman, a hunter, and above all, a rugged individualist, plays itself out in several of the photographs here that feature Russell. And it is one that was encouraged and cultivated by Nancy as a worthy and appropriate public image for the artist. Looking at a broad sweep of Russell's artwork, it is clear that much of it is infused with the masculine energy and centers around the dominating tasks required in settling and harnessing the wild spaces of the American West. Here in photographs, not only in the ones that were traded, but also in those that were sold to the public and sent to patrons, Russell's adoption of this masculine role acted as a visual bridge for the public audience between art and artist, creation and creator. But even more interesting than this is Russell's playing Indian. Russell appears frequently in photographs dressed in Indian garb and wig at Bullhead Lodge and in his studio and house in Great Falls. But it is within the bounds of Bullhead Lodge that his role-playing becomes more serious, as it is allowed to take shape within a generative landscape. The physical act of role-playing is one that is intimately connected with the body as it is with the imagination. In play, one becomes acutely aware of the surrounding environment and highly sensitized to its stimuli. Looking at these photographs, we are made aware of the rough and jagged landscape of the forest and can imagine, even now, the sounds that animate its presence. Here, too, we are also made aware of the body and the materiality of Russell's native garb and accoutrements. The weight of the hide garments and the heavy braid, drape of fringe, sounds of tinkling beadwork, and soft insole of the moccasin are collective stimuli that inform the movement, bearing appearance, and surely the imagination of the artist. Plains Indian culture is steeped in the materiality of things and the sensory experiences that they impart. This cultural sensibility lends itself easily to Russell. As an artist, and even more so as a sculptor, Russell harbors a deep understanding of and interest in material objects. Their weight, texture, smell, and possibility to become something else, something other, is an immersive experience for the artist and one that informs Russell's practice as a collector and a maker of things, as well as a play actor. Although troubling in its appropriation of native heritage, I believe that in trying on his Indian identity, Russell is, in a sense, performing through objects. His role play becomes an embodied appreciation of a culture he respected and one whose values, which prioritized artistry in the making of things, closely aligned with his own. Still standing to this day, Bullhead Lodge is located on the southern west shore of Lake McDonald. The Russells purchased the property from Diamond Apgar in 1905, 5 years before the surrounding area became America's 10th National Park. The main cabin of Bullhead Lodge was constructed from locally cut cedar logs and built by the Apgar family and other locals on a clearing 100 yards up from the hill from the lakeside. It was completed by the summer of 1906 and nicknamed Kootenai Lodge, before being rebranded Bullhead Lodge after Russell's newly trademarked signature, which was registered later that same year. Over time, Russell commissioned several more structures to be added to the property, including an outhouse, guest cabins, boat dock, and studio. But Bullhead Lodge is a uniquely situated property through which we can interrogate some of the social aesthetics that surround Russell over the 26 years of his artistic career that he owned and summered in the cabin. An artist himself, Russell would have been sharply attuned to the aesthetic environment, both social and physical, that surrounded him. Naturally, the little cabin in the woods fostered the cultivation of storytelling and narrative among its residents, especially when the resident-in-chief was Charles Russell. The photographs seen here that feature the interior of the cabin are ones that allude to the intimate conversations and contemplation, perhaps even the art of storytelling. As discussed earlier, the photograph and the oral narrative are fleeting creations that are both activated by memory. The phantom bodies and objects seen in these photographs act as visual reminders, prompting the viewer to recall the physical acts of both listening to speech and speaking aloud. In critic Roland Barthes' discussion on the pleasure of the text, he writes, quote, "I am interested in language because it wounds or seduces me," unquote. He goes on to describe the pleasure of the human voice as heard in the cinema, quote, "The sound of speech close up make us hear in their materiality, their sensuality, the breath, the gutturals, the fleshiness of the lips, a whole presence of the human muzzle, throwing, so to speak, the anonymous body of the actor into my ear. It granulates, it crackles, it cresses, it grates, it cuts, it comes, that is bliss," unquote. For Barthes, the grain of the human voice is, quote, "an erotic mixture of timbre and language," unquote, which can become a form of art, an art of articulation and of performance. The link between the materiality of the human body and the aural tones of speech allow us to see a relationship between sculpting and speaking. Thus, through speech, the guests of Bullhead Lodge can become artists, and their art, thus spoken, acts to sculpt the social aesthetics within the place itself. The open leaflet between Austin Russell and guests, the phonograph resting on the mantel, and the paired bodies open and relaxed on the verge of engaging their audience provoke us. As visual clues, they inform an atmosphere of art and performance in line with Russell's own making, and recall in our own minds the pleasure of the spoken word. Austin Russell's description of Bullhead Lodge is a beautiful and poetic reminder of the powerful impact that a physical place can have on the psyche. He describes it thus, quote, "Approaching through the timber, you would see the glowing open, all gold and amber, and up the slope and watching you, mysterious looking, the cabin, dark and secretive under its eaves. The brighter the day, the darker the eyes, which is to say the windows. It may be as bare as a barn inside. It always seemed to hide secrets," unquote. For Austin Russell, and perhaps in the minds and memories of many other visitors, Bullhead Lodge projected a warm aura of mystery and possibility. It was a place where the imagination could take root and be carried away in the creation of art, in storytelling, and in performance, drawing inspiration from the primitive and the sublime in nature. At the outset of its construction, Russell made several important aesthetic decisions that influenced and shaped the look of the property, and in doing so, worked to craft the atmosphere that surrounded Bullhead Lodge. One of the first design choices Russell made was to create a large bison skull out of planks of wood that he hung 10 feet off the ground on a pole at the foot of the lake. This skull functioned as a wayfaring guide and signal to guests approaching by boat from Apgar that they were headed in the right direction. The bison skull sculpture had been a part of Russell's artistic identity since childhood. Stationed at the rocky shore of Russell's property, the skull acted as a beacon and symbol to visitors that they were about to enter a special aesthetic environment, one fashioned by the sensitivities and proclivities of the cowboy artist. Russell used bison skulls as interior decor at both Bullhead Lodge and inside his Great Falls studio. According to his nephew, Austin Russell also created bear tracks using the heel and ball of his hand and the thumb and tip of his finger in wet cement that caught the rain off the cabin's eaves, as well as the incised decorations that he and Goodwin carved in the wet cement of the fireplace mantel. This staged photograph of the fireplace draws together various artistic projects that amused Russell and his visitors, including the signed and illustrated privacy screens, a toy boat often set sailing on Lake McDonald, incised mantel drawings, and what looks to be a piece of painted wood or fungi. Flanked by bogs of evergreen and illuminated by a cozy fire of brush and logs, the interplay of objects within this interior space, and the photographer both, strengthen the connection between art and nature at Bullhead Lodge. The communal creation of art, reinforced by play and performance, reveals the collaborative atmosphere that surrounded Russell and his guests and informed the social experience and aesthetic of the place itself. One of the more striking aesthetic decisions that Russell made concerning the construction of the cabin was architectural. He issued the builders a mandate to incorporate the 3 large fir trees that stood near the cabin and then into the design and construction of the building's large porch. The inclusion of trees not only signals Russell's sensitivity to nature and wilderness, it also provided a sense of presence, height, and naturalness to the new structure that had sprung up from the forest floor. In the artist's eyes, nature was not seen as an impediment or a force to be tamed, but rather a welcomed partner and collaborator in the creation of art and environment. In fact, Russell often utilized natural materials in his own art, searching out unique forms from which to build upon creatively. The ease of Kodak's snapshot camera allowed for the sharing of images to become an informal process of exchange between the Russells and their friends, the proof of which can be found in the proliferation of duplicate photographs found in many Russell archives. So having looked through hundreds of photographs for this talk, Russell still remains, for me, an almost inscrutable figure. As we heard Austin Russell remark, Bullhead Lodge always seemed to hide secrets, and I think the same too can be said of Charlie. Stirring beneath the surface of all these images is an undeniable sense of loss and erasure. The memories that were animated at the sight of these images are long dead and buried, and the phantom bodies that stare back at us jolt to life only within our own physical and visceral reactions to the images transcribed upon their fragile mediums. Now only art remains of the artist: photograph, painting, sculpture, and building. Out of these photographs and this art, what legacy can we glean from Bullhead Lodge? What phantom web of influence did it weave over its guests, its artists, and Glacier Park? Perhaps we can say that, like a match to tinder, Bullhead Lodge lit up the aesthetic sensibilities of its guests, subtly strengthening and refining their attention to the natural world and their own roles as participants in the creation of art and place. And for Charlie Russell especially, Bullhead Lodge became a haven where he could make art for art's sake. The seed of influence that Charlie sowed at Bullhead Lodge blossomed into the artistic legacy that defines Glacier National Park today. From within its modest boundary on Lake McDonald, Russell's cabin galvanized the imaginations and cultivated the aesthetic sentiments, not only of Russell himself and his artist friends, but also of numerous visitors and guests that stayed at the cabin over 26 summers from 1906 to 1926. After Bullhead Lodge came the construction of various chalets and lodges in Glacier that prominently featured the artwork of the park and whose owners commissioned artists like Charles Russell, John Ferry, and others to capture the beauty of the landscape, the animus of the wildlife, and the nobility of the local tribes in vibrant oils and watercolor. Just the same, these places too would become physical embodiments of art's spiritual connection with the natural world. And, as carefully curated spaces that played host to a revolving door of guests, these structures became visual echoes of the park's wilderness, nurturing both relaxation and contemplation as artists and visitors alike turn their boundless imaginations toward an art as a uniquely human expression of our place in the natural world. Thank you.